All right, so a week has now passed since Saudi Arabia announced that it was lifting its ban on women driving, on women obtaining driving licenses. Next June, women will be on the roads in Saudi Arabia all being well. Something that we've noticed here at the Arab Gulf States Institute is that this isn't just one thing that's changed. There is this rapid pace of change in many, many different aspects of life in Saudi Arabia. And we thought the best way to bring that out, rather than a 20,000 word paper, was to sit down and have a conversation here at the offices. So, what's going on in Saudi Arabia? Why is it happening? And what comes next? Well, all of this started with an economic reform plan. So I'm going to turn to Karen here on my right. I'm going to ask her, Karen, what's going on with the economy? What's happening with reform? And is there a link between these big social changes that we're seeing and what's happening within the economy as well?
Well, there certainly has been a slew of announcements, some kind of reform of the reform within, at the end of October, we're expecting a new national transformation plan, which will streamline what 18 ministries are involved in to about 10. So there's this constant word you hear inside of Saudi Arabia as well is a drive towards efficiency, a drive towards generating alternate sources of revenue for the state. I mean, I hear even from consultancies inside working with ministries saying that the border authority is being told, how can you generate revenue? So everyone is under immense pressure to demonstrate that the state can find alternate sources of revenue away from its oil, and also to streamline its expenditure. Unfortunately, the kind of last quarter results of the Saudi economy are not so good. Unemployment is up. There's been some concern about increase in the deficit. There's been some new bond issuance, so the government continues to borrow even though it's not really generating the kind of growth that it hoped to be able to spur within the private sector. They're also getting some sort of competing forms of advice. The IMF has said to the government of Saudi Arabia, slow down on some of these reforms, slow down on the rising price of petrol, on the reduction in subsidies, on cuts to the public sector employment, at risk of creating recession. And sure enough, that is what we seem to be seeing, a bit of a contraction and a potential recession in the Saudi economy. So it's a difficult business to calibrate how fast to do reforms, but it's also a difficult decision to know if things are moving in the right direction. And I think that's where kind of the social element comes into play.
Okay, and one of the things that we hear a lot, or heard a lot in the past, was Saudi Arabia is a conservative kingdom. There are all these Islamists, quote unquote, this undefined mass of people who stand in the way of reform. The family, the Al Saud, would like to reform, but we can't do it too quickly. Who are the Islamists, quote unquote, first? How are they responding, and how are people within the royal family responding to that response?
Right. Well, I think we can definitively say that this is not your father's Saudi Arabia. There's really tremendous change taking place in Saudi Arabia on the economic front, as Karen has mentioned, but that is also playing out on the political front as well. And I think what we see is a recognition in Saudi Arabia that this transformation is going to be very difficult, that this retreat of the state and attempt to diversify the economy is going to have real costs for society, and especially a lot of that falling on the young people who are just entering the job market. So I think there's a desire now to really shift the economy to a move where they can open up the economy in ways that really shift the society as well. Bringing in women, which we can see was very important with the entry of women now into driving and allowing them to drive. And also just broadening the space for the economy. There's a lot of emphasis on tourism and especially on entertainment too. And these are things that will change basically the character of Saudi society as well. And so it's kind of like a new national pact where basically there are going to be more demands on people in terms of what they're going to be expected to do in terms of the economy, but given a little bit more social space. The question of where the old kind of pact that they had, which was very based on a sort of Islamic legitimacy, stands is a real live one right now. And unquestionably, there's also a desire to move Saudi Arabia with a new basis of legitimacy, much more focused on nationalism, I would say, sort of a new national pact, like I said. And this means cutting back on the influence that Islamists, especially independent Islamists, have had within society.
All right. Now, Hussein, one of the things that we hear cropping up a lot when we talk about reform within Saudi Arabia is that a lot of what is being put forward looks an awful lot like what a certain neighbor, the United Arab Emirates, has been up to. And we're also hearing about a much stronger relationship between the leadership of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. What does that look like today, and how is it informing the way that Saudi is approaching this reform process?
Well, I think that's all accurate. Those impressions are largely correct, although how far it can go is still an open question. I think that's true of everything we've been talking about, including economic reform and the social changes that may emerge. In addition, there's a question to how much, say, an Abu Dhabi-influenced model of not only those things, but also kind of national strategy and security strategy, and also political orientation can apply to Saudi Arabia. But I do think it's the case that the Saudis are aware that the region has changed, that their traditional approaches on all these fronts and in terms of foreign policy and national security need to adapt. And so the question is, where is the model that can provide some guideposts? And I think that a tentative answer has been perhaps aspects of the Emirati and particularly the Abu Dhabi approach might be. So you can see, for example, not only is there closer cooperation between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, for example, on the confrontation with Qatar over its policies, but also the changing attitudes which Kristin was just describing towards Islamists. It certainly moves Saudi Arabia much closer to an Emirati attitude towards the politicization of Islam and Islamic politics, where I think you never, again, there are limits. You're never going to find the same kind of total rejection or largely rejection of Islamic politics in Saudi Arabia, because the state is so closely identified with religious traditions. The role of the monarchy as the custodian of the holy places, the state as the birthplace of Islam. All of that is a central foundational identity of the Saudi state and the monarchy. Nonetheless, I do think you do see a much closer convergence here between Saudi and Emirati attitudes, not just practically as we saw in the intervention in Yemen, but also in terms of ideology and the way in which they look at the role of political Islam. It's becoming closer, and the Emirati skepticism about Islamists in general is spreading to Saudi Arabia, starting to inflect their policies to some extent. And I think you can look forward to much closer ties. The question will be, what are the limits? How far can this go? And when does it? When do the differences, the great differences between this small city-state and its confederated partners in the UAE versus this gigantic country, very diverse and a very different kettle of fish, Saudi Arabia, with a different history, when does that mean? When do the diminishing returns kick in? And
I'd love to turn that back to you guys. The UAE, a pretty small country, large expatriate population. Saudi Arabia, a bigger, much more diverse in many ways country with a very different history, a very different outlook historically. How possible is it to create a Saudi Arabia, let's say within the next decade, that looks more like its smaller neighbor?
For me, I think the question is more, how much is the UAE willing to invest in this change in Saudi Arabia? So it may be manifest in ways that are similar to the UAE's trajectory of economic development, for example, but it doesn't have to be a carbon copy. I think the question for me is how much the UAE is willing to spend for its own security and stability for Saudi Arabia to have some degree of success, however that success is defined. And it looks like right now they're willing to spend a lot. they're heavily invested. So certainly politically invested in the success of King Salman and the Crown Prince, but also economically, more interested. So we're seeing this in some ways. For example, there was a bid for construction of a solar power plant in Saudi Arabia by the UAE entity Masdar this week, the lowest world price for producing solar electricity that's ever been tendered. And this shows you it's not a market price, right? This is a subsidy of that asset. It's not clear if they'll win, but it is clear that the UAE is putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak, in their political support for Saudi Arabia. And I think we'll see that in other sectors and other ventures as well.
But then what's going on here that we see Saudi Arabia, which is generally thought of as this incredibly wealthy, incredibly rich country, either needing or its neighbor perceiving a need within Saudi Arabia to effectively have a subsidy. Is that fair? I mean, is there a sense that this is something that the kingdom's going to need? What is the kingdom's fiscal position, financial position that this is happening or has to happen?
I think they probably see it more as a partnership, right? And so in renewable technology, it looks good. It's part of the Vision 2020, 2030 objectives. It sells well in both places. It's an important priority. In terms of fiscal need, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think this tips the bucket or makes this one particular deal. It makes a big difference. But I think the general support for the opening of the Saudi economy will only stand to benefit UAE, right? And the opposite will only hurt them.
Right.
Absolutely. And Kristin, when you look at Emirati society, which is, I think, often misunderstood, people don't have that good of a grasp on what it is. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what social life looks like in the UAE and whether or not it's possible for Saudi Arabia to move significantly in that direction. And maybe it would be great to hear as well, talk a little bit about how big a deal the driving ban being lifted is.
Well, I think it's important to recognize, first off, that some of the underlying trends here were already there under King Abdullah. The absolute need, necessity of diversification in the economy. Also, the growing skepticism about Islamists and the need to kind of curtail their independent kind of movement within the country. Both of those trends were already there. I think what we see now is just this real acceleration under King Salman and especially under the young Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who's really decided to embrace this model and to bring it into Saudi Arabia and to present this new model, especially relying on young people and trying to build this new bargain with them. And I think part of that is recognizing something that was really afoot in the kingdom, which is that this generation really is changed. I mean, their ability to communicate with one another, to connect with the outside world, the kind of things that they want, some of it informed by what they see in their neighboring countries, both in the UAE and also in Qatar, really is shaping this new generation. And so I think addressing some of the limitations that we saw in Saudi Arabia before, boredom, to put it, is one thing that's being addressed here, but also trying to give it a new shape and direction to how they want to build Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Boredom is politically dangerous. Bored people can be inspired to, mischief.
I think, though, they do recognize that this is going to be a really difficult project for the economic reasons that Karen mentioned, and also for the reasons that, these kinds of changes are not going to be universally loved. And I think that also informs a lot of the crisis with Qatar as well.
Yeah.
I think, and as well informs a lot of the arrests that we saw in Saudi Arabia that preceded the lifting of the driving ban. They recognize that there needs to be real control over this process, or that's what the government has determined.
Right.
And so that means controlling kind of the information and the narrative about where this is going. On the women's, though, I didn't get to talk about that. It definitely is something to celebrate for women in Saudi Arabia. This new opening goes beyond actually just the driving. We've seen a lot of other changes taking place in terms of opening for women, a lot of different new areas of employment. a lot of the other changes that are taking place, recognition that there's going to need to be an anti-harassment law to, again, protect women as they move more into these new public spaces, and appointments, a lot of government appointments and within prominent positions, and also to the Shura Council. So there definitely is, and we can see this paralleling what we've already seen in the United Arab Emirates and some of the other Gulf countries, a real push to bring women more to the forefront within society.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it sounds like we won't be bored for the foreseeable future.
I'm pretty sure not.
Thank all of you for speaking. I think we've reached our time limit. Thank you at home for watching, or in your office, or wherever you are. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.